When Jake's grandfather passed away last spring, he left behind more than just memories. The old man had owned a small cabin up in the mountains of northern Georgia, right on the edge of a beautiful lake. Jake had spent summers there as a kid, fishing off the dock and listening to his grandfather's stories about buying the land back in the 1950s for almost nothing. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and coffee when Jake went in for the reading of the will. He expected maybe some family photos, perhaps the old fishing rods, maybe even the cabin itself if he was lucky. What he didn't expect was to inherit 47 acres of prime lakefront property. His grandfather had quietly held onto that land for over 60 years, paying the taxes every year without complaint, never selling even when developers came knocking with big offers. Jake worked a stressful job in Atlanta, managing a warehouse that seemed to create new problems every single day. The idea of having a place to escape to on weekends sounded perfect. The cabin needed work, sure. The paint was peeling, the porch boards creaked, and the kitchen hadn't been updated since sometime around 1985. But it was solid. It was quiet, and it was his. He took a week off work to clean the place up. The drive up from Atlanta took about 3 hours, winding through smaller and smaller towns until the roads turned from highway to state route to narrow mountain lanes. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded by tall pines that must have been there for 100 years. The first few days were peaceful. Jake spent his time sweeping out years of dust, replacing a few broken windows and just sitting on the dock watching the water. The lake was gorgeous, especially early in the morning when mist rose off the surface and you couldn't hear anything except birds and the occasional fish jumping. He noticed the other cabins, of course. They were up on the hillside surrounding the lake, big fancy places with huge windows and perfect landscaping. They looked like they belonged in a magazine. His grandfather's cabin, by comparison, looked like what it was, an old fisherman's retreat that had seen better days. But Jake didn't mind. It had character. The letter arrived on his 4th day there. It was in his mailbox at the end of the drive in a crisp white envelope with a return address for something called the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. Jake figured it was maybe a welcome letter or an invitation to some community cookout. It wasn't. The letter informed him that his property was currently out of compliance with community standards. It listed several violations, including exterior paint colors not matching the approved palette, an unapproved dock structure, a vehicle that didn't meet aesthetic requirements, and landscaping that failed to meet minimum standards. At the bottom, in bold letters, it requested his attendance at the next HOA meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Jake read it twice, confused. He'd never joined any homeowners association. His grandfather certainly hadn't mentioned anything about it. He called his dad that evening to ask about it. His father laughed. "Your grandpa used to complain about those people. They built those fancy cabins about 10 years ago and immediately started acting like they owned the whole mountain. He ignored them completely. Told me once they had no authority over his property. That made Jake feel a bit better, but the letter still bothered him. He decided he'd go to the meeting just to clear things up and explain that there must be some mistake. The meeting was held in the community center building near the entrance to the Pine Ridge development. Jake showed up in jeans and a flannel shirt, feeling underdressed when he saw the other attendees in their polo shirts and pressed slacks. The room went quiet when he walked in. A woman at the front table stood up. She was probably in her late 50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She introduced herself as Patricia Hendricks, the HOA president. She asked Jake to take a seat in the front row. What followed was one of the strangest experiences of Jake's life. Patricia pulled out a folder that must have been 2 inches thick. Inside were photographs of his property, printed emails, and a marked-up copy of what she called the Pine Ridge Community Guidelines. She went through each violation methodically. The cabin needed to be repainted in one of 7 approved colors within 60 days. The dock needed to be rebuilt to match the standard Pine Ridge dock design. His truck, a beat-up Ford from 2008, needed to be kept in a garage and out of sight. The lawn needed professional landscaping, with specific plants from an approved list. The list went on and on. Jake tried to interrupt several times, but Patricia kept talking over him. Finally, during a pause, he managed to get a word in. "Look, I appreciate the information, but I don't think my property is actually part of your HOA. My grandfather bought this land in the 50s, way before any of this was here. Patricia's smile got tighter. All properties within the Pine Ridge area are subject to our covenants and restrictions. Your grandfather may have thought he was exempt, but I assure you he was not. We've been lenient because of his age, but now that the property has changed hands, we need compliance. Another board member, a man in an expensive-looking sweater, chimed in. These rules exist to protect everyone's property values. I'm sure you understand that a rundown cabin affects the entire community. Jake felt his face getting hot. My cabin isn't rundown. It's just old. And again, I don't think I'm part of your association. Patricia slid a document across the table. This outlines the penalties for non-compliance. After the 60-day notice period, fines begin at $200 per day for each violation. I suggest you take this seriously. Jake left the meeting angry and confused. $200 a day? That was insane. He couldn't afford that. And he certainly couldn't afford to repaint and rebuild everything they wanted. That night, he couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about his grandfather, who'd owned that cabin for decades without anyone telling him what color to paint it. Something didn't add up. The next morning, Jake started making calls. He found a real estate attorney in the nearest town who agreed to look over his property documents. He also started digging through boxes of his grandfather's old papers that were stored in the cabin's bedroom closet. His grandfather had been a meticulous record keeper. There were property deeds, surveys, tax receipts going back decades, and old correspondence. Jake spread it all out on the kitchen table and started organizing it chronologically. The attorney called him back 2 days later with good news and bad news. The good news was that his property was almost certainly not subject to the HOA's authority. It had been purchased and titled long before the HOA existed, and there was no record of his grandfather ever signing any agreement to join. The bad news was that proving this might require going to court if the HOA didn't back down, and that could get expensive. Jake decided to try the reasonable approach first. He wrote a formal letter to the HOA, explaining his position and attaching copies of his property deed and the attorney's opinion. He sent it certified mail so they couldn't claim they never received it. Their response arrived within a week. It was short and cold. The HOA rejected his position and stated that all properties in the area were subject to their rules, regardless of when they were purchased. The fines would begin as scheduled. They also mentioned that they'd be filing complaints with the County Code Enforcement Office about various violations. That's when Jake realized this wasn't going to be simple at all. The harassment started small at first. Jake noticed it during his second weekend back at the cabin. There were people walking around his property with cameras taking pictures of his truck, the cabin, even his firewood pile. When he went outside to ask what they were doing, they just said they were documenting violations and walked away. Then the official letters started arriving. The County Code Enforcement Office sent him a notice about tall grass, even though he'd mowed just 3 days earlier. Another letter complained about a junk vehicle, referring to his perfectly functional truck. A third letter claimed he was storing building materials illegally, which turned out to be a neat stack of firewood by the cabin wall. Jake called the Code Enforcement Office to ask what was going on. The woman on the phone sounded tired. She told him they'd received multiple complaints from concerned citizens about his property. When Jake asked who filed the complaints, she said that information was confidential. But she did let slip that all the complaints had come from the same neighborhood association. He started getting phone calls too. Unknown numbers that would call and hang up. It happened so often that Jake eventually just stopped answering calls from numbers he didn't recognize. His mailbox was also being stuffed with more HOA notices, each one threatening higher fines and legal action. The worst part was the rumors. Jake's dad called him one afternoon to say that someone had told him Jake was dumping waste into the lake. Another neighbor from town mentioned hearing that Jake was running some kind of illegal business from the cabin. None of it was true, but the story spread anyway. Jake felt like he was under siege. Every time he drove up to the cabin for a weekend, he wondered what new complaint would be waiting for him. The place that was supposed to be his peaceful retreat had turned into a source of constant stress. One Saturday morning, Jake woke up to find someone actually on his dock, taking measurements and more photos. This time, Jake had had enough. He marched down there in his pajamas and told the guy to get off his property immediately. The man, who introduced himself as a board member named Robert something, acted like Jake was being unreasonable. We have every right to document violations, Robert said, not even looking up from his clipboard. You're trespassing, Jake shot back. Get off my dock right now or I'm calling the sheriff. Robert finally looked at him, smirking. Go ahead. We know the sheriff. He understands we're just trying to maintain community standards. Jake did call the sheriff's office. A deputy came out about an hour later, by which time Robert was long gone. The deputy was polite but didn't seem very interested. He told Jake to put up no trespassing signs if he was worried about it. That evening, Jake sat on his porch feeling defeated. He'd spent thousands of dollars on attorney fees just to be told he was in the right, but the HOA didn't care. They had more money than him, more time, and apparently more connections with local officials. He started to wonder if he should just sell the place and be done with it. But then he got angry. His grandfather had held on to this land for 60 years. He'd fought off developers who wanted to buy it, stuck to his guns when people said he should subdivide and make a fortune. The old man had loved this place and he'd wanted Jake to have it. Giving up felt like letting his grandfather down. Jake decided to go on the offensive. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, he'd need to understand exactly what he was dealing with. He started attending their monthly meetings regularly, sitting in the back and taking notes. He recorded everything on his phone, making sure he had documentation of what was said. At one meeting, Patricia announced that they were raising the assessment fees for all residents. Several people grumbled, but no one really objected. At another meeting, the board voted to spend $15,000 on new decorative lighting at the community entrance. Jake watched as they spent money like it grew on trees. He also started talking to some of the other residents, the ones who didn't seem to be part of Patricia's inner circle. There was an older couple who'd been there since the development first opened. They told Jake that the HOA had become much more aggressive in the past few years after Patricia took over as president. Before that, they said, things had been much more relaxed. A younger guy who lived 3 streets over mentioned that he'd received similar violation notices for having his boat trailer visible from the street. He'd ended up building an expensive shed just to avoid the daily fines. Another woman said she'd been fined for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. Jake realized he wasn't the only one being targeted. The HOA seemed to see themselves as enforcers, making sure everyone lived exactly according to their vision of what the community should be. And Patricia, it seemed, really enjoyed the power. One night, unable to sleep, Jake decided to go through his grandfather's papers again. He'd already looked at the property deeds and surveys, but there were other boxes he hadn't fully explored. Tax records, old correspondence, miscellaneous documents and folders labeled with years going back to the 1960s. He found the parking lot paperwork almost by accident. It was in a folder marked 1972, stuck between some old tax receipts. The document was a lease agreement between his grandfather and the county. Jake almost skipped past it, thinking it wasn't important, but something made him stop and read it carefully. His grandfather had leased a portion of his land to the county for use as a public parking area. The lease was for $1 per year, renewable annually. Jake vaguely remembered the parking lot. It was a big gravel area down by the lakeshore, where people launched boats and parked when they wanted to access the water. The interesting part was at the bottom of the agreement. There was a clause stating that either party could terminate the lease with 90 days written notice. Jake sat up straighter, his heart beating faster. He pulled out the property survey and compared it to the lease description. The parking lot was still on his land. He owned it. The county had been renting it from his grandfather for 50 years at $1 per year. But as far as Jake could tell from the papers, he'd inherited that lease along with everything else. He started looking for more information about the lake itself. His grandfather had always called it the lake, but Jake realized he'd never actually asked who owned the water. He'd just assumed it was public, or maybe owned by the county. The survey map showed property lines extending well into the water. Jake traced them with his finger, his excitement growing. Unless he was reading it wrong, his property included the entire lake. Not just the shore, not just a portion, but the whole thing. It was his private lake. Jake couldn't believe it. He checked again, then a third time. He pulled up county GIS maps on his laptop and compared them to the survey. Everything matched. The lake was his. And that parking lot, the one that every single Pine Ridge resident used to get their boats to the water, was his too. He understood now why the development had been built where it was. The hillsides around the lake offered gorgeous views, and everyone had assumed they'd have easy access to the water via that parking lot. The developers had probably never even thought to check who actually owned it. They'd just seen a public parking area and figured it would always be there. The next morning, Jake called his attorney. He could barely keep the excitement out of his voice as he explained what he'd found. The attorney told him to bring everything to the office that afternoon. When Jake spread all the documents on the conference table, the attorney started going through them one by one. He was quiet for a long time, occasionally making notes or pulling up information on his computer. Finally, he looked up at Jake with something close to a smile. "This is all legitimate," the attorney said. "You own the lake. You own the parking lot. The lease with the county is still active, but you have the right to terminate it with proper notice." Jake felt dizzy. "So if I ended the lease, the parking lot would just be my private property?" "Correct. There'd be no public access. And since you own the lake too, that means no one would have legal right to use the water without your permission." Jake thought about all those big, expensive cabins on the hillsides, the ones owned by Patricia and Robert and all the other HOA board members who'd been making his life miserable. They'd paid premium prices for those properties specifically because of the lake access. He'd overheard someone at one of the meetings mention that the exclusive lake community selling point had added at least 30% to property values. Only it wasn't exclusive lake community access. It was all access to his lake, through his parking lot, which they'd been using because his grandfather had been generous enough to let the public use it for basically free. Jake looked at his attorney. "What happens to their property values if there's suddenly no lake access?" The attorney raised an eyebrow. "I imagine they'd drop significantly. The development is built on steep hillsides. Without that parking lot, there's no practical way to get boats to the water. And without permission to use the lake, well, having a lake view doesn't mean much if you can't actually use the lake." For the first time in weeks, Jake smiled. He finally had leverage. The question was what to do with it. Jake spent 3 days thinking about what to do. Part of him wanted to immediately send termination notices and watch the HOA panic. But another part, the part that still believed in doing the right thing, thought he should give them one more chance to back off peacefully. His attorney advised the peaceful approach. "You have all the power here," he said. "But if you want to actually live in that cabin and enjoy it, having the entire community as enemies won't make your life pleasant." "Give them a chance to make this right," Jake agreed, though he wasn't optimistic. He'd seen how Patricia operated. She didn't seem like the type to back down easily. The next HOA meeting was on a Thursday evening. Jake arrived early and asked to be added to the agenda. Patricia looked annoyed but agreed, putting him last after all the regular business. Jake sat through 45 minutes of boring HOA stuff. They discussed landscaping contracts, argued about whether to repair or replace the community mailbox structures, and debated the rules about holiday decorations. Finally, Patricia called on Jake. He walked to the front of the room carrying a folder with copies of all his documents. His hands were sweating, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "I've asked to speak tonight because I think there's been a misunderstanding about my property," Jake began. "As I've explained before, my grandfather bought that land in the 1950s, long before this development existed. I've had an attorney review everything, and he's confirmed that my property is not subject to HOA rules." Patricia interrupted. "We've been over this. All properties in the area—" "Please let me finish," Jake said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. "I'm not here to argue about that anymore. I'm here to show you something you might not be aware of." He held up copies of the property survey and the parking lot lease. "My grandfather owned 47 acres of lakefront property. That included the lake itself and the land where the public parking lot is located. He leased that parking area to the county 50 years ago for $1 per year, as a kindness to the community." A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Patricia's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed Robert lean over and whisper something to her. "Here's what matters," Jake continued. "That lease is still active, and I inherited it along with the property. The lease agreement includes a termination clause. Either party can end it with 90 days written notice." Now he had everyone's attention. Someone in the third row gasped. A man near the back pulled out his phone, probably to look up property records. "I also own the lake," Jake said. "The entire lake. It's not public water. My property lines extend to include all 35 acres of water that your community was built around." The room erupted. People started talking over each other. some standing up to see the documents better. Patricia banged a gavel, trying to restore order. "This is absurd," she said loudly. "That lake has always been public. Everyone knows that." "I have the surveys right here," Jake replied, holding them up. "Anyone who wants to verify this can check with the county." "I'm not making this up." Robert stood up, his face red. "You can't just take away public access. That's illegal." "It's not public access if it's private property," Jake's attorney said. He'd come to the meeting too, sitting quietly in the back until now. "The county has been leasing the parking area, but they have no ownership rights. And they certainly don't have any rights to the lake itself." Patricia looked like she wanted to argue, but even she seemed shaken. She called for a 5-minute recess, and the board members huddled together at the front table, whispering urgently. When the meeting resumed, Patricia's tone had changed slightly. She was trying to sound diplomatic, though Jake could hear the anger underneath. "Let's say hypothetically that what you're claiming is true," she said. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we end this nonsense," Jake said. "Stop harassing me. Stop filing false complaints with the county. Stop trespassing on my property. Give me a written apology and a written acknowledgement that my property is not subject to HOA rules. Do that and everything continues as it has been. The parking lot stays open. People can use the lake. Nothing changes." He paused, making eye contact with Patricia. "But if the harassment continues, I'll terminate the parking lease and exercise my full property rights regarding the lake. And I'll do it immediately without any further warnings." The room was dead silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Without the parking lot, their boat launches and water access disappeared. The lakefront community they'd paid premium prices to live in would become just a bunch of expensive cabins on a steep hillside with a nice view of water they couldn't legally touch. Patricia's face had gone very pale, but she recovered quickly. "This sounds like extortion." "It's not extortion to exercise legal property rights," Jake's attorney interjected. "Mr. Reynolds has been more than patient. He's offering to maintain the status quo in exchange for being left alone to enjoy his own property." "That seems more than reasonable." A woman in the front row raised her hand. She was older, probably in her 70s, and looked worried. "Can you really do this? Take away the parking and lake access?" Jake felt bad for her. She didn't seem like one of the troublemakers, just someone who'd bought a cabin to enjoy retirement. "Yes, ma'am, I can. But I don't want to. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just want to be left in peace." Robert stood up again. "You realize that if you do this, you'll destroy property values for the entire community. People will lose hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then maybe you should stop trying to force me out of my home," Jake replied. "I've made a fair offer. Take it or leave it." Patricia called for another recess, this time for 15 minutes. Jake stepped outside to get some air. His heart was racing, adrenaline pumping through his system. He'd actually done it. He'd stood up to them. His attorney joined him outside. "You did well in there. You were clear and firm without being aggressive." "What do you think they'll do?" Jake asked. The attorney shrugged. "Hard to say. The smart move would be to take your offer. But people don't always make smart choices when their pride is involved." When the meeting reconvened, Patricia's face was like stone. She spoke in a clipped, cold voice. "The board has discussed your proposal. We reject it completely. Your claims about the property are dubious at best, and we believe they would never hold up in court. The board has voted to increase your violation fines to $500 per day, effective immediately. We're also pursuing legal action to force compliance with community standards." She smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "If you think you can bully this community with fake property claims, you're sadly mistaken. We have significant legal resources, and we will use them." Several board members nodded in agreement. Robert was actually smirking like they'd just won some great victory. Jake looked around the room at the other residents. Some looked worried, some looked confused, but most seemed to be following the board's lead. Only a handful seemed to realize what was really happening. Jake gathered his papers calmly. "Okay then. I gave you a chance to handle this the easy way. What happens next is on you." He walked out of the community center with his attorney behind him. Outside in the parking lot, his attorney started to speak, but Jake held up his hand. "I know what I need to do," Jake said. "Can you draft the termination notices first thing tomorrow?" "Are you sure?" the attorney asked. "This is going to get ugly. Really ugly." Jake thought about Patricia's smug smile, about Robert's smirk, about all the harassment and stress they'd put him through. He thought about his grandfather, who'd been generous enough to share his property with the community for decades, asking almost nothing in return. "I'm sure," Jake said. "They made their choice. Now they get to live with it." The next morning, Jake's attorney sent formal 90-day termination notices via certified mail to both the county and the HOA. He also sent individual letters to every property owner in Pine Ridge, explaining the situation and what it would mean for them. Jake drove back up to the cabin that weekend to post no trespassing signs. He put them all around the lake shore and at every entrance to the parking lot. The signs were professional and clear. Private property. No trespassing. Lake access by permission only. Violators will be prosecuted. He also installed a chain and lock at the entrance to the parking lot, though he left it open for now. The termination wouldn't take effect for 90 days, and until then, the county's lease was still valid. The reaction was swift and explosive. By Monday morning, Jake's phone was ringing constantly. He got angry calls, threatening calls, begging calls. Someone left a voicemail calling him the worst person in the world. Another message was from a woman crying about how she'd just bought her cabin and couldn't afford to lose the lake access. Jake felt terrible about the innocent people caught in the middle. But he couldn't back down now. Patricia and the board had made their choice. They'd called his bluff, probably thinking he wouldn't actually do it. They'd been wrong. His attorney called him Tuesday afternoon. "You're not going to believe this, but the HOA has filed for an emergency injunction to stop you from closing the parking lot." "Can they do that?" Jake asked. "They can try. We have a hearing scheduled for next week. But honestly, they don't have a leg to stand on legally. The property is yours, the lease terms are clear." Dennis turned out to be different from the board members. He was a retired engineer, straightforward and practical. They met for coffee at a diner halfway between Atlanta and the cabin. Jake brought his attorney along, just in case. "Look, I'll be direct," Dennis said after they'd ordered. "Most of the community had no idea what Patricia and the board were doing to you. We knew they were strict about the rules, but we didn't know they were actively harassing you and filing false complaints." Jake stirred his coffee. "How did you find out?" "Your letters. The ones your attorney sent to everyone. A bunch of us started comparing notes after that. Turns out you're not the first person they've targeted, just the first one who couldn't be bullied into compliance." Dennis shook his head. "There's a guy who spent $20,000 rebuilding his deck because they said it wasn't up to code. A couple who sold their place and moved because they couldn't deal with the constant violations notices." "So why didn't anyone stop them?" Jake asked. "Because most people don't go to the meetings. They pay their HOA fees and assume the board is handling things properly. Patricia's group, they're the ones who show up every month, who volunteer for committees. They've basically taken over through attrition." Dennis pulled out a folder of his own. "After your announcement about the parking lot, I started making calls. I've got signatures here from 43 households. That's more than half the community. We're demanding an emergency special election to replace the entire board." Jake was surprised. "That many people are on my side?" "It's not about sides," Dennis said. "It's about not losing our property values because the board decided to pick a fight they couldn't win. Even if people don't like you, and I'm not saying they don't, they like losing their lake access even less." "The board is telling everyone you're bluffing," Dennis continued. "Patricia sent an email yesterday saying your property claims are fraudulent and that their attorney says you don't have a case." Jake's attorney spoke up. "Their attorney is wrong, or they're not listening to him. The property records are clear. Jake owns the lake and the parking lot. The lease termination is completely legal." Dennis nodded. "That's what I figured. So here's what I'm proposing. Give us 30 days to hold the special election and get a new board in place. The new board will accept your terms, give you the written apology and acknowledgement you asked for. In return, you agree not to close the parking lot or restrict lake access." Jake wanted to trust Dennis, but he'd been burned before. What if Patricia wins the election? What if nothing changes? She won't win. I've been talking to people all week. Everyone's furious at her for letting it get this far. But if somehow she does win, or if the new board doesn't honor the agreement, then you do whatever you want with your property. We'll have it in writing." Jake looked at his attorney, who gave a small nod. The offer seemed reasonable. "Okay," Jake said, "but the termination notices stay active. If I don't have a signed agreement within 30 days, the 90-day clock keeps running." "Fair enough," Dennis said, extending his hand. They shook on it, and for the first time in weeks, Jake felt a little bit of hope. That hope lasted about 5 days. Patricia clearly had no intention of going quietly. She sent out her own letter to all residents, claiming that Dennis and his group were being manipulated by Jake. She called an emergency board meeting and passed a resolution stating that any board member who negotiated with Jake would be immediately removed for violating their fiduciary duty. She also followed through on the legal threat. The HOA's lawsuit hit Jake with everything they could think of. They claimed he was creating a public nuisance, that there was an implied easement for the parking lot, that his grandfather's lease had created permanent public access rights, and that closing the parking lot would violate county development agreements. Most of it was nonsense, according to Jake's attorney, but it would still take time and money to fight. Patricia knew that. She was betting that Jake would run out of resources before she did. The harassment escalated too. Someone spray-painted greedy on Jake's truck in the middle of the night. His mailbox was knocked over twice. He came up one weekend to find garbage dumped on his lawn. When he called the sheriff, the deputy who responded was the same one from before. He filed a report but didn't seem optimistic about catching whoever did it. Jake started to wonder if he'd made a huge mistake. Maybe he should have just sold the place when he first inherited it. Maybe his grandfather's gift had turned into more trouble than it was worth. But then Dennis called with an update. The special election petition had been certified. Despite Patricia's attempts to block it, there were going to be new board elections in 3 weeks. Dennis and 4 other residents were running on a platform of common sense leadership and community cooperation. The campaign got nasty. Patricia and her supporters put up signs calling Dennis's group puppets of outside interests. They sent emails claiming that the new candidates would bankrupt the HOA by giving in to Jake's demands. One letter suggested that Jake and Dennis were secretly working together to defraud the community. Jake stayed out of it as much as he could. He'd done his part. Now it was up to the residents to decide what kind of community they wanted to be. The court hearing for the HOA's injunction happened 2 days before the election. Jake put on his only suit and sat behind his attorney while the HOA's lawyer made his arguments. The lawyer was expensive looking, the kind who probably charged $500 an hour. He talked about community expectations and good faith and the public interest. Jake's attorney kept it simple. He showed the judge the property records, the survey maps, the lease agreement. He pointed out that the HOA was claiming rights to property they'd never owned and had no legal basis to control. The judge asked a few questions, read through some documents, and then made his ruling. The injunction was denied. Jake had every legal right to terminate the lease and control access to his property. The HOA's other claims would need to be addressed in a full trial, but the judge strongly suggested they consider settling instead. Patricia looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. Her expensive attorney whispered to her urgently, probably telling her what Jake's attorney had been saying all along: they were going to lose. 2 days later, election day arrived. Dennis had organized carpools to make sure everyone could vote. Turnout was apparently the highest in the HOA's history. People who'd never been to a meeting showed up just to cast their ballots. Jake didn't hear the results until that evening. Dennis called, and Jake could hear celebration noises in the background. "We won," Dennis said, his voice excited. "All 5 seats. Patricia and her entire board got voted out. It wasn't even close." Jake felt relief wash over him. "So what happens now?" "Now we start fixing things. The first official act of the new board will be to vote on accepting your agreement. We're holding an emergency session tomorrow night. Can you be there?" Jake said he'd be there. The community center had a very different energy the next evening. Instead of the hostile, tense atmosphere Jake had experienced before, people actually smiled at him. A few came up to introduce themselves and apologize for what had happened. Patricia was there too, sitting in the back row with her arms crossed. She didn't look at Jake, but he could feel the anger radiating off her. Dennis called the meeting to order as the new board president. The first item of business was Jake's agreement. Dennis read it aloud, a formal written apology for the harassment, acknowledgement that Jake's property was not subject to HOA rules, agreement to pay for the new fence Jake wanted to install, and a renewed lease for the parking lot and lake access at the original $1 per year rate for 20 years, with termination clauses if the HOA violated the agreement. "Does anyone want to speak on this proposal before we vote?" Dennis asked. Patricia stood up. "I'd like to say that this is a shameful capitulation to threats and intimidation. This board is setting a precedent that anyone can blackmail this community if they have enough leverage. An older man, a few rows ahead of Patricia, turned around. No, Patricia. This board is fixing the mess you created. If you'd just left the man alone in the first place, none of this would have happened. Several people applauded. Patricia sat down, her face red. The vote was unanimous. All 5 board members voted to accept the agreement. Dennis pulled out a prepared document that had been drawn up by their attorney. Jake read through it carefully. Everything they'd discussed was there, spelled out in clear legal language. He signed it, Dennis signed it, and it was done. People actually clapped. Someone shook Jake's hand and thanked him for not closing the parking lot. A woman apologized for the spray paint on his truck. Jake left the meeting feeling something he hadn't felt in months. Actual peace. Over the next few weeks, things slowly returned to normal. The HOA sent the formal apology letter, typed on official letterhead. Workers came and installed Jake's new fence, a nice split-rail design that marked his property boundaries without blocking anyone's view. The parking lot stayed open, and people used the lake just like they always had. Patricia resigned from the HOA entirely and put her cabin up for sale. Robert and the other old board members kept low profiles. Jake heard through Dennis that they were embarrassed about the whole situation. Jake spent more weekends at the cabin. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the following months. Jake spent most weekends at the cabin, sometimes the whole weekend, sometimes just Saturday nights. The place was becoming what it was always meant to be, a refuge from the stress of his regular life. He finished repainting the cabin, but in colors he chose, not from some approved list. He rebuilt part of the dock, making it stronger and adding a section where he could clean fish. He even got a kayak and started exploring the lake more thoroughly, discovering little coves and spots his grandfather had probably known about. The relationship with the Pine Ridge community slowly improved. At first, people were cautious around him, still not quite sure how to act. But gradually, they realized Jake wasn't some villain trying to ruin their lives. He was just a guy who wanted to enjoy his property in peace. Dennis became a genuine friend. They'd fish together some mornings, or Dennis would come by with his wife for dinner on the porch. Other neighbors started being friendly too. The older couple Jake had met early on, the ones who'd told him about Patricia's aggressive leadership, invited him to a community cookout. It was strange being welcomed into a community that had tried so hard to drive him out just months earlier. But Jake understood that most of these people hadn't been the problem. They'd just been living their lives, paying their HOA fees and trusting that their board was acting in their best interests. The lawsuit took longer to resolve. Patricia had hired that expensive attorney, and even though she was no longer on the board, she was personally continuing the legal fight. Jake's attorney said it was probably about pride at this point. She couldn't admit she'd been wrong. The new board wanted nothing to do with her lawsuit. They filed paperwork to withdraw the HOA from the case, leaving Patricia to pursue it on her own if she wanted. Without the HOA's financial backing, her attorney dropped her. She tried to represent herself for a while, filing motions that the judge kept dismissing. Eventually, Patricia's case was thrown out entirely. The judge ruled that she had no standing to sue since she didn't own the property in question and had suffered no personal damages. He also ordered her to pay Jake's legal fees, which had added up to about $12,000. Jake heard she sold her cabin shortly after that and moved away. He felt a little bad about it, honestly. She'd made terrible choices and picked a fight she couldn't win. But he hadn't wanted to destroy her life. He just wanted her to leave him alone. The county was much easier to deal with. When Jake's attorney sent them the lease termination notice, they'd called within a week to negotiate. The county parks director came out to meet with Jake personally. "Look, we understand this is your property," the director said. "We should have been more proactive about maintaining the relationship with your grandfather. When he passed, we should have reached out to you right away." Jake appreciated the honesty. "So what are you proposing?" "We'd like to continue the lease arrangement if you're willing. The parking lot provides access not just to the lake, but to hiking trails that connect to the state forest. It's valuable public infrastructure." They negotiated a new lease, this time for 10 years instead of just 1 year at a time. Jake agreed to the same $1 per year rate, but with a condition. The county had to maintain the parking lot properly, keep it clean, and put up better signage. He also included a clause that if the HOA ever violated their agreement with him, The county lease would automatically terminate too. The director agreed immediately. They shook hands and Jake felt good about it. His grandfather had wanted the community to have access to the lake. Jake was just making sure people didn't take that generosity for granted. Summer came and the lake was busier than ever. Jake noticed more families using the parking lot, more boats on the water. The new HOA board had worked with the county to improve the boat launch area, adding better lighting and safety features. They'd even created a little beach area where kids could swim, though they'd asked Jake's permission first. One July afternoon, Jake was sitting on his dock reading a book when a boat pulled up nearby. A man and woman with 2 young kids waved at him. "Sorry to bother you," the man called out. "Are you Jake Reynolds?" Jake waved back. "That's me. I just wanted to say thank you. We bought our place up on the ridge last month and everyone told us the story about what happened with the old board. The whole reason we could afford to buy here was because prices dropped during all that uncertainty. So thank you for not actually closing the parking lot," the man's wife added, "and for standing up to that horrible HOA board. Apparently they made a lot of people miserable before you stopped them." Jake smiled. "Just wanted to fish in peace. Glad it worked out for everyone." The family waved goodbye and motored away. Their kids were laughing, splashing water at each other. It was a good sound. That evening, Dennis stopped by again. He'd gotten into the habit of dropping in on Friday evenings if he saw Jake's truck in the driveway. "Got some news," Dennis said, accepting the beer Jake offered. "The HOA just finished our annual financial review. Turns out Patricia's board was spending way more money than they told anyone about. Legal fees, consulting fees, all kinds of stuff. The community was actually running a deficit." "Seriously?" Jake asked. "Yeah. The new board is implementing actual financial oversight now. We're cutting unnecessary expenses, being more transparent about where money goes. It's amazing what happens when you have board members who actually care about the community instead of just controlling it." They talked for a while about HOA politics, which Jake found more interesting now that he wasn't the target of it. Dennis mentioned they were planning to update the community guidelines to be less restrictive and more reasonable. "People should be able to enjoy their properties," Dennis said. "That's the whole point of having a cabin in the mountains. We don't need rules about exactly what shade of brown your firewood pile can be." Jake laughed. "That was a real rule?" "Patricia proposed it at a meeting once. We voted it down, but she tried." As summer turned to fall, Jake found himself spending more time at the cabin than in Atlanta. His job was stressful, and he'd started wondering if he really needed to be working warehouse management for the rest of his life. He had some savings. The cabin was paid off. His expenses were low. One weekend in October, with the leaves changing colors around the lake, Jake made a decision. He gave his notice at work. He'd find something remote he could do from the cabin, or maybe just take a few months off to figure out what he really wanted. His grandfather had worked hard his whole life and then spent his retirement years at this cabin, enjoying the simple things. Maybe Jake could skip the waiting until retirement part. He called his dad to tell him about the decision. "Your grandfather would be proud," his dad said. "He always said that property was meant to be enjoyed, not just owned. He spent the best years of his life there. Did he ever tell you why he held on to it for so long?" Jake asked. "He could have sold and made a fortune." His dad was quiet for a moment. "He told me once that the lake had taught him everything important he knew. Patience from fishing, respect for nature from watching the seasons change, the value of peace and quiet in a noisy world. He said some things are worth more than money, and that land was one of them." Jake looked out at the water, golden in the sunset light. He understood exactly what his grandfather had meant. The winter was quiet. Jake worked on indoor projects, insulating the cabin better and updating the kitchen. The lake froze over in January, and he learned to ice fish from Dennis. It was peaceful in a different way than summer, beautiful and stark. Spring came early that year. By late March, the ice had melted and early flowers were blooming. Jake was clearing brush from around the cabin when a car pulled up his driveway. He didn't recognize it. A young couple got out looking nervous. The woman was holding a folder. "Are you Jake Reynolds?" she asked. "Yes, can I help you?" "We hope so. We're looking at buying property in Pine Ridge, and our realtor told us we should talk to you first. Something about lake access and parking." Jake smiled. It seemed his reputation had become part of the new owner orientation process. He invited them to sit on the porch and explained the whole story, starting with his inheritance and ending with the current agreements. The couple listened intently. "So basically," the man said when Jake finished, "as long as people don't act like jerks, everyone gets to enjoy the lake?" "Pretty much," Jake said. "That seems fair," the woman said. "We just want a quiet place to bring our kids on weekends. We're not looking to join any boards or get involved in drama." "Then you'll probably be very happy here," Jake told them. After they left, Jake sat on the porch for a while thinking. His grandfather's simple act of generosity, leasing that parking lot for $1 a year, had shaped this entire community. And when people tried to take advantage of that generosity, to use it as leverage to control someone else, it had almost destroyed everything. But in the end, it had worked out. The bad actors were gone, the community had learned some valuable lessons, and Jake had a home he loved. His phone buzzed with a text from Dennis. "Fishing tomorrow morning?" Heard the baser biting. Jake smiled and texted back, "I'll bring coffee." He went inside to get his fishing gear ready for the morning. Through the window he could see the lake, peaceful and calm.